Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and I have talked endlessly over the last 12, 15 years about a wonderful Old Norse text that survives in the Poetic Edda called Hávamál, or in modern Icelandic pronunciation, Hávamál. And I have translated it in both my translation of the Poetic Edda and in my standalone Wanderer's Hávamál, which includes the Old Norse text too. And both of those also include my special Cowboy Hávamál translation, which is a separate thing. It's me taking the wisdom of Hávamál and putting it into my grandfather's voice. And I've written quite a bit about Hávamál in secondary literature. For example, I was asked to write an article about it for an Encyclopedia of Medieval Literature being put together by Ármann Jakobsson at the Árni Magnússon Institute in Iceland, where the manuscript is kept. All that is to say, I feel fairly qualified to talk about this text, and one of the things that has continued to recur in discussions about it, especially as it's gotten better known, is this notion that it is a quote-unquote Viking code of ethics. And I just feel this is a very inept way of describing this text. For one thing, it is not a code of ethics or anything else, right? What's a good example of a code of ethics, right? What is definitely a code of ethics? Well, the Ten Commandments would be a good example, right? We have a memorable set of 10 things that we are told to do or not to do. And at least in translations into languages that I know, those commandments are placed in the imperative. They are, you do this or don't do that. And I think that a lot of workplaces have codes of ethics and that they are phrased in a similar way. Do this, don't do that, and ideally they're short enough that there's a pretty memorable set of things we do and we don't do. We don't cheat, but we do treat each other with respect, that sort of thing. And Hávamál really doesn't qualify on that definition of a code of ethics. We have 164 stanzas, most of which stand alone, a few of which are thematically connected or tell a linked story. But even all of those stanzas probably, I strongly believe, are not originally composed as one single poem. I don't think there are very many people in the scholarly community who do think they would be one single poem. For one thing, the date of different stanzas is quite different. So we have some stanzas that are among, my studies suggest, the oldest stanzas in the Poetic Edda, especially around the parts where Odin is talking about the relationships between men and women and his attempts, both failed and successful, to court women. And then we have much, much later, like 2 centuries later, Old Norse, and something like Lodfafnismal, the stanzas that are addressed to Lodfafnir. By the way, it's those late stanzas in Lodfafnismal that have more imperatives, which still isn't very many, than other stanzas in the poem. So there's not one cohesive thought from stanza 1 to stanza 164. There's no attempt to list ethical precepts, right? Although people have extrapolated in the modern period the 9 noble virtues or other lists of things you should and shouldn't be from this poem. There's no list as such of 9 virtues in Hávamál. You could easily condense it down to 7 or 11 virtues if you wanted to kind of abstract from the different lessons. There's no reason to favor 9 other than its association with Odin and the Norse gods. But really, each stanza has its own thought. And they're not phrased in the imperative. There's not, do this, don't do that. In fact, in translation, I've rephrased some of those stanzas as imperatives just because they make more sense as imperatives in English. But generally you hear not, wise man do this, but rather, a wise man does this, right? We get little example stories often, right? We get, and very often, not just example stories, but a sense that the narrator, who most stanzas don't give the impression is Odin, although there may well have been, and there really does seem to have been, a strong tradition of associating these stanzas of wisdom with Odin. That we get a strong impression that the narrator has learned from experience. The narrator talks about having been drunk when he says that you shouldn't get drunk. He talks about how he's done foolish things when he was in love, when he says you should be tolerant of people who do foolish things when they've fallen in love. He even seems to have contemplated suicide when he spends several stanzas around stanza 70, like 69, 70, 71, talking about how much better it is to be alive than dead. And I think that all of that adds up to a tone that if you read through Hávamál, and really just read it, it doesn't take very long. It probably takes, I think, 45 minutes, to read, just read it from front to back. It's not a novel. The tone is not at all that of a code of ethics, and it's something that is so illustrative and so based on personal experience and having failed to heed the advice that it shares. It's much, much more like the conversational tone of sitting around a campfire with someone and listening to, the stories of a old man who admits his foibles and what he's learned from them and is trying to spare the youth the trouble of learning those lessons the hard way. I think that's something quite different from a code of ethics. I also think that the word Viking is not very properly associated with something like this. Yes, I do think from linguistic dating criteria that most of Hávamál, other than Lodfalknismál, again, actually was composed during what we call the Viking Age. I think probably 900s AD is a good ballpark for oral composition for most of those stanzas. But, this is a funny thing for an Old Norse specialist to say, or maybe a very characteristic thing for an Old Norse specialist to say, but what's a Viking? Right, in Old Norse, it's a pirate. It's not something people call themselves. Certainly not everybody in this culture is a Viking, quote unquote, right? Viking is something you do in the summer. You go and you raid your richer neighbors and you take the stuff they have that you don't have. But this is not at all a glorification of combat, right? There's a stanza that says that if you don't fight, you might think that you're going to live forever, but old age isn't going to be kind to you either. Okay. It's not exactly glorifying combat. It's treating combat as kind of a chore, something that's going to happen at some point in your life, which is probably realistic for someone in the Viking Age or Middle Ages. But nothing about, nothing about going to Valhall, nothing about being the Drengr that the Norse sagas and Skaldic poetry and Viking Age memorial stones and poems about the prototypically masculine Viking god Thor would make us think would be characteristic of, Viking ship crews. Nor is there the emphasis on family that you see in a lot of that literature. Hávamál is a very individualistic document, and even when it encourages you that it's better to have a son than not, that's because no one's going to raise a memorial stone to you, right? It's still kind of a selfish motivation for having a stone. There's nothing about, honor your family or be true to your family or anything like that, which crappy quotes on the internet float around attributed to Hávamál that look like that, but there's nothing like that really in Hávamál. Hávamál is very, very much a, it feels like a desperado's poem in a lot of ways. To me, that's part of what made it easy to translate into that cowboy voice of my grandfather's. And I think that's another point to keep in mind, is that it's pretty easy to translate Hávamál into other languages. There's no very specifically Viking concepts in it. All of the advice is perfectly applicable to today or to Sumeria, right, or wherever, right? You could get this anywhere. It sounds like the kind of advice that old men give younger men. It does not specifically seem like the code of ethics that you would have on a Viking. What's the code of ethics you'd have on a Viking ship? Don't betray your buddy. Split the loot equally. get up early enough in the morning and be ready to do what we need you to do, right? That's a code of ethics that you might need on a Viking ship. Hávamál is instead what you get when you come back from those Viking expeditions with broken bones and trauma, and realize that the world is bigger than you thought it was, and you sit down by the fire with the much older man who kind of nods at you and says, see, I told you. This is what the world is like, as old men have been doing for a very, very long time, and lots of cultures other than just the Vikings culture. So I think Hávamál is very special. Obviously, this is nothing about how it isn't special or bad or whatever. People tend to hear these messages that way sometimes. I just think that Viking Code of Ethics 0% sums up what it is. It is a unique book of philosophy and meditations that probably in oral composition dates to the Viking Age. That's a little bit more of a complicated tagline, doesn't market as well, but nobody ever said I was a good marketer. At any rate, if you've never checked out Hávamál, maybe give my translation a try in either one of those books. Wanderer's Hávamál has the Old Norse. Second edition of the Poetic Edda has a lot of other poems and maps and a lot of cultural context. So good for different things. And yeah, to all of you out there, thanks Patreon, and wishing you all the best.